Hello everyone, welcome back to Castle Goring, chatting with Lady C. Hello Georgie, how are you today?
Hello, Leo. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm excellent, thank you.
Oh, good.
And today
Good.
I see we have Treasure with us.
Yes, we have Treasure with us because several people have asked
Yes.
about the cats. So I'm down to one cat, and some of the people have asked if they could see the cat.
Yes.
So I'm showing Treasure. Treasure, say hello, honey. Say hello. Say hello, Boysy Boysy. Oh, yes, you sweet Treasure.
Treasure.
Oh, oh
Well,
yes,
Mickey's
Mickey.
jealous.
And Mickey loves playing with
Ah,
Treasure.
ah.
Oh, Mickey's kissing Treasure.
Oh.
Okay, enough of Treasure now, because I think otherwise it will become a cat and dog show.
Yes.
And so I will take Treasure back
Okay.
and put him where he belongs.
No problem. Okay, we are going now with the first question. Are you ready?
Yes, I am, and so is Mickey.
Mickey as well. So the first question is, you previously mentioned the descendant of Mark Sykes of the Sykes-Picot line. Have you anything to contribute regarding Lawrence of Arabia, Mark Sykes, Gertrude Bell, and Faisal I? I would love to hear.
Well, better than me contributing anything, I will ask Mark Sykes himself, who is the grandson of Mark Sykes of the Sykes-Picot line, to come and join us and tell us whatever he can about the Sykes-Picot line, the Middle East, and very importantly, about modern day slavery. So I think, shall we hold fire on this one so
Yes.
that Mark himself can comment?
Yes.
Because he's fascinating, and I think people who are interested in that period of history will be absolutely intrigued to hear from Mark himself.
Yes.
Much better him than me.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Mark is a very interesting person, and
Yes,
it
yes,
will
he is.
really interesting for people to hear everything from the first hand
That's
from
right.
him.
That's right.
So-
Out of the horse's mouth,
Yes.
so to speak. Okay,
Okay,
so
so
next question, Leo.
So the next question is, and I'm a bit sorry how it's starting, but I will read it whole. So I admire Lady C, but she said the French Revolution was, of course, the first of the great revolutions, in the quotes. So should we in the US be offended that she doesn't think the American Revolution and its shot heard around the world was great?
Well, actually, I gather that there's more than one person who's addressed this issue. All I will say is that the American War of Independence was not a revolution. It was a war of independence. America was a colony. France was a state that broke itself asunder. If you break yourself asunder, that's something else. The French Revolution preceded the American Civil War, which I suppose you could say, in a manner of speaking, was a revolution, although it's not regarded as a revolution, it's regarded as a civil war. So, in fact, I would say I'm intrigued that people have asked the question, but I basically think that it's apples and oranges. I was speaking about apples, they're speaking about oranges.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So, before we get into the heavy duty questions, can we start with one snappy question? And it was where the lady sees accents from.
Oh, well, that's very simple. It's Jamaican. It is, I admit, not what people think of as the average Jamaican accent, but it is a very definitely Jamaican. It used to be called the Upper St. Andrew accent. It was the accent that all people of a certain type had. And I gather from friends of mine it's dying out. because it's the younger generation, they've either been educated abroad or it's more the Jamaican definition of estuary English has
Yes.
come into play. So, but it's very typically Jamaican of its kind.
Okay.
So,
Well, it's very
but actually,
interesting.
Leo,
Yes.
a few people have asked about your accent as well, and some people even thought you were Italian. But of course,
Yes.
you're not.
No.
It's
No.
a Croatian
Yes.
accent.
Well, depends because some people in Croatia having really, heavy English accent, like similar if you listen Russian people speaking
Yes.
English. So mine it's not very much like this. I don't know how and why, but
Mm,
it's really strange.
mm,
Because people thought that I'm or French or Italian or Spanish or I don't know Latin American,
mm, mm,
Brazilian.
mm.
Well, but it's a bit mix, I think, of
Well, it helps
accents.
to
Yeah.
have lived in various places, doesn't
Yes.
it?
Yes.
So, okay, onwards and upwards. What's the next question?
Next.
Hit me with another one, Leo. Hit me with another one.
So, did you know or ever met Bob Marley? And what else can you tell me about Bob Marley, if there is anything?
Mm, yes, I only met Bob Marley once.
Mhm.
He was living at 104 Old Hope Road. No, he wasn't. He was living at 104 Hope Road, which was owned by Chris Blackwell. I think it's now the Bob Marley Museum. And I was in Jamaica and I went to pick up a friend who was staying there. My recollection is that the friend was Joanna Hart.
Mhm.
Joanna says it wasn't her, but I remember that it was her. So maybe my memory is playing tricks with me. Maybe after 50 something years, her memory is playing tricks with her. But anyway, whoever it was, somebody was staying there who was a friend of mine. And I was introduced to him. We were sitting in the drawing room, and in came this chap. And in this was 1968, and in came this Rasta-ish looking guy with locks, and it was very unusual in those days for Rastas to be mixing in our world. Uh, in fact, it was very unusual for Rastas to be mixing generally because they were a very small and marginalized sect in 1968. Subject to a lot of prejudice by many of the ordinary Jamaicans, and also suspected by the establishment and because of their beliefs. The one thing that militated in their favor was that they were by and large peaceable, but they had acquired a reputation because they smoked weed, as it was called, ganja.
Yes.
It's a part of their
Culture,
religious
yeah. I mean,
practice. And so that caused a lot of suspicion because people were terrified that, ganja sent you mad and all of that sort of stuff is what people thought in those days. So, I mean, we're speaking about very primitive times,
Yes.
ancient times. And anyway, so in came this chap, and I was introduced to him. And we spoke for a little while, and he was very personable, and I was myself.
So, what was your first impression of him?
Well, that he was a Rasta. He had locks, not huge locks, but slight locks, which, as I said, was unusual.
Yes.
To meet a Rasta at all was unusual. I might have run across one or two before, but I'd never actually met one socially.
Yes.
So that in itself was unusual.
And this moment, he was already famous, or
not
was
at
just
all,
beginning?
not at all. It was 1968, and whoever it was that I think it was Joanna, said when he left the room, she said, you know, he's going to be a huge star. And I thought, really? I saw no indication of it whatsoever.
Okay.
And, well, of course, very rapidly, he did become a huge star.
Yes.
And, but I never ever met him again. But there were many interconnections, so to speak, because one of his queens, Cindy Breakspear, was a childhood friend of mine. We all grew up together. Cindy was a member of what you would have called the St. Andrew set. We were pretty much the same age. We all went to each other's parties. Another of his very close affiliates and great friends was Diane Jobson, who also became his lawyer. And Diane, again, is an old friend of ours. We used to go to the Jobsons' parties. They used to come to ours. I knew her brother, Sticky, and Jimmy very well as well. We were all in the same crowd. Jimmy was a little bit younger than us. So Jimmy was my sister, youngest sister's age group. But Diane and Dickie were our pair group. And she became his lawyer. Dickie was Chris Blackwell's partner, who founded Island Records and who put Bob Marley on the map. And Chris is a very distant cousin of mine because his mother, Blanche Lindo, was a relation of my great-grandmother. And so there were a sort of connections. Then when Bob got ill,
yes,
he had melanoma, and there were one or two rather sad things that happened that I'd really prefer not to go into, because I don't want to be violating anybody's confidences, and it's things I was told by friends, and it's not a book that I'm writing, and even when I write books, there are certain things that I don't violate, because you can't be honourable and violate people's confidence. Otherwise, nobody else will ever trust you. You'd very quickly get a reputation for being a traitor, which thank God I've never got, and won't ever get either. So anyway, but Bob got ill, and he made one or two really grave errors. He had his acolytes. He was like the emperor surrounded by courtiers, some of whom were very, what in Jamaica you'd call roots people, who were rather less well-educated and sophisticated. And some of them encouraged him in ways that really prevented him from getting the medical treatment he should have got immediately. And by the time he really went hell for leather with proper medical treatment, it was too late. I mean, he died at 36, so he was really young. And when he was dying, my brother Mickey, he was a lawyer, he had a law firm in England. And of course, because Dan and Mickey were not only friends but colleagues, Dan phoned him up and said, could he make the arrangements for Bob to go to Germany, to this health place, really a desperado clinic. And of course, Mickey did whatever he needed to do. So I sort of knew what was going on through Mickey. And we realized he wasn't going to make it, which was very sad, because by then he was not only a national hero, but he was an international hero. And I mean, I remember in the early 90s in Red Square, I think it was 1991 or 92, I'm in Red Square and somebody with a huge ghetto blaster walking by with No Woman, No Cry. I thought, wow, really? Bob's got everywhere, even in communist Russia. And anyway, he died.
Yes.
And then after he died, there was a huge law case because in Jamaica, I don't know what it was like then, but I know now all legitimate and illegitimate children have equal rights. I don't remember what it was like in those days. It might well have been that they all had that legitimate children had equal rights as illegitimate children. I don't remember. But the important thing is Bob had several children from several different queens, as they were called. Rastas have queens. There was Rita, his wife, legal wife, with legitimate children. There was Cindy, who was one of his queens, with her son, and there were others. And there was this huge lawsuit which trundled throughout the Jamaican courts and then through the House of Lords. And Mickey handled the English part of the lawsuit for the Bob Marley estate. Coincidentally, because of course Jamaica is very small and the Jamaican establishment is very small and everybody knows everybody else, so to speak. If I don't know you exactly, I know your first cousin. So there's always a way through. And it just so happens that my first cousin, paternal first cousin, my father's second youngest sister's son, Tony Winkler, who was a very famous writer, he did Sidella's autobiography for her. Sidella was Bob's mother, and this would have been in the mid-90s, maybe late 90s. Can't remember exactly when, but I was living in Bourne Street because I had Tony and his wife and Sidella for dinner, and when they came over to promote the book. So that's the full extent of my Bob Marley knowledge and experience.
Good. It's very interesting.
Oh, sorry, I lie, actually. I lie, sorry, because of course I knew the Marleys as well. Because Bob Marley's father was a white Jamaican, and his mother was a black Jamaican. And I grew up with the Marleys. And in fact, Bob's father's cousin's wife, Beryl, wanted me to marry one of her sons. I forgot that. And Beryl was really great, actually. And she said something to me that I've never forgotten, because at the time everybody was going on and on about my looks. And she said, Georgie, I'm going to tell you something that nobody else will tell you. She said, everybody's raving about your looks. She said, your greatest asset is your personality. She said, never forget it. Looks will fade, but personalities flourish.
Well, that's true. I think it's good.
And so, yeah, and I've got friends who are very friendly with members of the Marley family. So I see them and I see the children when I'm in Jamaica. And, if we're at weddings, we always run into each other, or if I'm in Jamaica staying with friends. And if Nicola is if I'm staying with friends in Jamaica, say I'm staying with Nicola and her great friend is Dan, Marley, and I see the children, the beautiful daughter who is Nicola's goddaughter. So there's still sort of very peripheral links. But Bob himself, I only ever met once. But I have to tell you, very good reports about him. Very good reports. Everybody really liked him. He was a good guy. And he was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, when you stop to think, he is world famous. And he and Chris Blackwell and Dickie Jobson put a school of music on the world map, reggae. Reggae is one of the most crystalline schools of music of the 20th century. Little Jamaica, we can be very proud.
Yes.
So enough said about.
It's very interesting. Thank you for your experience sharing it with us. So our next question is, I do want to hear if Lady C has any details of Marguerite Alibert, a mistress of King Edward. She blackmailed the royal family in order to be acquitted of murdering her husband, an Egyptian prince. She reminds me of Meghan Markle.
Oh dear. Well,
Okay.
Meghan Markle's never killed anybody.
Yes.
Okay. So I don't see how that is possible for her, for in fairness to Meghan Markle. But moving on from that observation.
Yes.
Yes, she became known as Princess Farmy.
Mm-hmm.
She married Ali Farmy Bey.
Mm-hmm.
She was born in, I think, about 1890. She was a very good-looking woman, and she ended up in a very, what I suppose people would, in the vernacular, call a high-class bordello. It was called the Maison de Rendezvous in Paris. And in those days, girls from humble backgrounds who were good-looking and ambitious would be trained up to be courtesans, what we now call high-class call girls. And she was one of them. And I don't remember the name of the madame who ran the establishment, but she was the Madame Claude of her day. Madame Claude was a very famous madame when I was young. Many of my boyfriends, people like, I remember one of my boyfriends used to tell this story about when he went to Madame Claude's. He ran into Georges Pompidou, who I forget now was either the president or the prime minister of France at the time. So this was much earlier, but it gives an idea of the tone of the establishment. And Marguerite was obviously not only good looking, but resourceful and intelligent and quick off the mark, so to speak. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to make the transition from common whore to rather chic courtesan. Because being a courtesan wasn't only about giving good blowjobs and doing as in when you had to do it, which I'm sure those were both integral parts of the job, but they also had to be entertaining out of bed, and they had to be presented as ladies, even though everybody knew they weren't. Edward VIII, when he was Prince of Wales during the First World War, I think it was in April 1917, if I remember correct. It might have been 1916, but I think it was 1917. He met and became completely besotted with Marguerite Alibert. She gave him a good time like he'd never had before. And he was very young. Anyway, they started a roaring affair, which was wildly inappropriate for any gentleman, much less a prince, to be having with a tart. It was one thing to pay her way and even to set her up in an establishment, but to actually end up falling in love with her or being so besotted with her that you were seen out and about with her flagrantly was wildly inappropriate. But the Prince of Wales of the day was very frank. One of the Duke of Windsor's great failings, as well as virtues, as Edward VIII became, was his frankness. It worked both for and against him. And certainly people at the palace were ripping out their hair, wondering what to do and how to reel him in while he was so completely besotted with Marguerite Alibert, and writing her the most extraordinary letters, including complaining about his father, who he didn't get on with, to this tart. Well, fast forward to about 1920, 1922. The romance between Edward, the romance, fast forward to about 1920, 1921. By the end of the war, the romance, I suppose is what we'll have to call it, between David, Prince of Wales, and Marguerite Alibert has come to a fortunate end. He's fallen in love with Lady Rosemary Lucy-Gore, whose father is the Duke of Sutherland, but whose mother, Millicent, Duchess of Sutherland, is regarded as beyond the pale by George V, who was a terrible prude, so he prevents that marriage with, as we all now know, completely disastrous consequences, because had David been allowed to marry Rosemary Lucy-Gore, none of what happened thereafter would have happened. So there'd have been no abdication, etc., etc. So anyway, Marguerite has flourished now because she's had the association with the Prince of Wales as a feather in her cap. She's feted everywhere for being a poule de luxe, as they used to call them. And she goes to Egypt and she meets Ali Fahmy Bey. Beys are not really princes. Emirs are princes. Beys would be really more lords. It was an Ottoman and honorific, but in England it was sometimes called prince. It's not really prince, but so he fell in love with her, and blow me down, he married her. I mean, can you imagine the horror where his family was concerned? They couldn't believe that this aristocrat had married this tart. But she was very clever and very canny and very wily, and she had him sewn up tightly. But of course, once they were married, the trouble started, because she married him and she could not make the adjustment adequately to being a true lady, and she became huge trouble, and they used to have terrible rows, and she understood that if he divorced her, she would get nothing, because he was from a very well-connected Egyptian family, and in those days Egypt was not only a British protectorate, but it was also a monarchy, and the king of Egypt completely disapproved of the marriage of this Egyptian aristocrat to this French whore. And they were in London, staying at the Savoy. They had been to see The Merry Widow. I think it was 1923, if I remember correctly.
Well, you were just 16, so you couldn't
I wasn't.
remember.
By then I was 32.
Okay.
I never lie about my age, darling. and they'd been to the theatre to see an operetta by Lehar called The Merry Widow. And they went back to the Savoy. They had a row. There's always been the suspicion that she engineered rows because she had it in her mind to bump him off before he could divorce her. And they had a blistering row, and she shot him several times in the back.
Oh.
She was arrested, charged with murder, and she was represented by a very famous advocate of the day. And the behind-the-scenes story is that she got her lawyer to apply pressure on the British government and the royal family because she had all of the Prince of Wales's letters, including complaints about his father, which would have created a huge scandal. And the trade-off was that she would be found not guilty if she didn't, but she would be found not guilty, and she would hand over the letters at the end of the trial if she was found not guilty, failing which she would bring in the Prince of Wales into the murder case. And the way the judge directed the jury and the way the judge suppressed evidence, he suppressed evidence of her bad character, which was validly allowed. He allowed the suppression of evidence regarding her career, which at the time was allowed. So he was almost directing the case in such a way that she would be found innocent. He also allowed the most shocking allegations to be made against Ali Fahmy Bey, which included that she had developed piles because he used to bugger her. Well, I don't think you get pals from being buggered by a husband for 2 years. You might get pals from being buggered by many clients over a period of nearly a decade. But I don't think it's going to happen quite so quickly. I'm not a medical expert, but I think it stretches the imagination. But this is the sort of evidence that she was allowed to give, and that he was an oriental brute and a beast and a sadist who had defiled this poor innocent European flower. So there were sort of the Occident versus the Orient, and Oriental beasts taking advantage of wonderful European flowers. I mean, just a farce, a farce. But it had the desired effect. She was acquitted. She then tried to sue in Egypt his estate to get all of his money, and the Egyptian courts did what the British courts did not do. They pitched her claims out ignominiously and showed that they were actually, in this instance, rather more interested in justice than an accommodation, shall we say. And she ended up in Paris. She lived in Paris. She still had money because she had been a very successful prostitute. I suspect she most likely continued to be a very successful prostitute. She also was known as Princess Fahmy. She was notorious, while she had never been acceptable in civilized society. She was certainly a figure in the demi-monde, and, I suppose the equivalent of the celebrity world nowadays, where pretty much anything goes as long as you're known. It doesn't matter what you're known for. And so she lived a very sort of raffiné life. I would imagine half the time on the flat of her back. And she died aged 80, quite recently. So,
Yes.
Which I suppose I don't remember exactly when, but if we do the math, 71, yeah,
Yes,
which is
something.
to me recent.
Yes, you were just what?
Well, back then I
5
was about,
years old.
no. In 1971, I must have been about 122. Don't I look great for 197?
Perfect.
So that's it.
That's it. Thank you very much for answer. It's very interesting topic.
No.
I didn't know about this. It's
Yeah,
very
fascinating.
interesting. Yes,
Fascinating.
very fascinating.
And anyway, I think we have some rather juicy bits for everybody in the next video, don't we?
Yes.
But we're not going to say what they are right now.
Yes.
But
well,
one or two little juicy bits. And of course, my book is then going to be published
soon,
next week,
soon.
towards the end of next week.
Yes.
So
we will address this as well.
Yeah.
Yes, great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again for everything. Keep writing your questions and see you very soon. Again, take care.
Thank you so much. And Mickey and Treasure said to say goodbye.
As well, yes. Thank you. Goodbye.